It's fine. The Zack Snyder cut of Justice League is fine. It's much more cohesive than the nonsensical, slapdash, theatrical cut of the film. There are reasons to care for each character. The villain has at least a passable motivation. The lore is fleshed out. The self-serious tone is more consistent. And it has the funniest sound effect ever put in a movie. At the same time, it's only about as good as a story this basic can be. It is still just a story about stopping a bad guy from collecting some magic boxes. There's just some better character work between all the chasing. What's most interesting to me, though, is that its existence gives us a chance to do something we normally aren't able to do. The ability to look at a film and tell which parts can be attributed to which creator. Unsurprisingly, when we do that, we find a film that is very much a Zack Snyder film. It is consistent with his usual visual style, common themes, and overarching ideology. But what I want to talk about is how the elements of his style that usually irritate me are all here, but for a variety of reasons, they are mitigated in one way or another, making this a more conventional movie that I think is, well, fine. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, what is the Snyder Cut? The Snyder Cut is the newly edited and expanded upon version of the 2017 film Justice League. Zack Snyder was originally the director of that film, but stepped down from the role in 2016 after the tragic death of his daughter. This was shortly after the release of Batman v Superman, the second of Snyder's DC films after Man of Steel. Neither film was particularly well received by critics, nor were they quite as successful at the box office as Warner Brothers hoped. As a result, even before Snyder quit Justice League, there was significant consternation within the company about the direction the film was going, with multiple rewrites during production. This is why it's still a little difficult to write sentences like Zack Snyder quit the project with 100% certainty, because there's conflicting reports that Warner Brothers wanted to replace him on the project. But regardless of whether he quit, was fired, or something in between, what matters is that during post-production of the film, Snyder was no longer on the project. Warner Brothers then hired Joss Whedon, fresh off of his run of directing the first two Marvel Avengers movies, and tasked him with completing the film for a November 2017 deadline. From this point, the project is retooled to be more comedic and shorter than what Snyder would have wanted. Whedon comes in and basically does what he is asked to do, and gets the movie across the finish line after significant reshoots. The result is a film that is in a huge hurry to get nowhere, with little to say and no real character development, and also just a lot of sexism. But it is at least a story with a beginning, middle, and end, and has a relatively brief running time at just under 2 hours, allowing Warner Brothers to maximize the number of screenings per day. It didn't really work out for them, though. The film was the lowest grossing DC Extended Universe movie at the time, and with another critical and commercial failure on their hands, Warner Brothers shelved their plans to make a series of interconnected DC superhero movies to rival what Marvel is currently doing with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and instead moved forward with producing a handful of loosely connected individual films like Aquaman, Birds of Prey, and Wonder Woman 1984. But in the years that followed, a group of very online fans of Snyder's relentlessly bullied Warner Brothers and anyone who would listen, and a bunch of people who wouldn't, to release the Snyder Cut, hoping to see his original version of the film. It wasn't as simple as putting out an unreleased cut, though, but was essentially an entirely new project, requiring another $70 million worth of reshoots and post-production to create. With the rise of streaming services and HBO Max, a Snyder Cut became a more financially reasonable project since they wouldn't have the same restraints on runtime. So Snyder got to do basically whatever he wanted to do.
Is this kind of your vision, complete creative freedom?
Yeah, they didn't have any notes, not really.
Really?
Notes they had, I didn't do, so.
Most importantly for what I want to look at, though, is that Zack Snyder sort of got to live out his dream of being a real-life Howard Rourke. Howard Rourke is the protagonist of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, an architect who believes that his creative vision shouldn't be infringed upon by anybody else. In the climactic sequence, he blows up a building of his after people make modifications to it against his will. Now, if you don't know, Zack Snyder is very openly an Ayn Randian libertarian. He believes wholeheartedly in her philosophy, and it pops up all over his work, which we'll talk about in a minute. What's relevant at the moment, though, is that while working on his cut of the film, Snyder reportedly refused to use any footage shot by Whedon, saying, "I would destroy the movie. I would set it on fire before I use a single frame that I did not photograph." Now, setting aside my feelings about his political beliefs, the fact that he did this is actually really useful to a person like me because it makes it much easier to identify which shots are from the original production, which shots are from the Joss Whedon reshoot, and which are from the Zack Snyder reshoot. The most obvious difference between the cuts is their very different tone and aesthetic. This scene between Lois Lane and Martha Kent is definitely shot by Whedon and is fully lit in a flat and uninteresting way. A similar scene between the two characters shot by Snyder has harder shadows that create a more interesting atmosphere. The Whedon cut has a brighter color grade, the Snyder cut is darker across the board. The Whedon cut has a ton of awkward comedy, the Snyder cut has at least less than half as much. But what I really want to talk about is framing, how the subjects on screen are presented to the audience and what message the audience is supposed to receive. I think this is the most distinctive element of Snyder's style, and the reason he is such a popular director. Snyder's camera glorifies his subjects almost all of the time, and he often uses an excessive amount of slow motion to keep those characters in these highly stylized poses for longer than usual. These are often shots that end up in trailers because they are very evocative. The problem with this technique is that Snyder usually doesn't show a lot of discretion in where and when to use it. He just uses it across the board as much as possible. Like, look at this scene in Dawn of the Dead. So there's this nice old lady character who's in the background for part of the movie, but then she has a major scene where she discovers a horrible secret. Right before that happens, she snuffs out a cigarette and it's filmed like this. When you're a background character, you go unnoticed, but when Snyder puts the camera on you, it doesn't matter who you are, you're suddenly the bride. Where Snyder puts narrative focus is often the central reason why a lot of his adaptations wind up inverting the ideas of their source material. And since his entire filmography consists of adaptations of one sort or another, with the exception of Sucker Punch, this is a problem that comes up a lot. As many other critics have pointed out, his adaptation of Watchmen is nearly identical to the graphic novel it is based on, not just in terms of narrative structure, but in recreating the visuals of the comic for the film. But he also twists the imagery in places to create meanings that are in direct opposition to what the comic was about. He adds a ton of indulgent violence to a story that was originally about the toll that the cycle of violence has on people. Most egregiously in Watchmen is the attempted rape scene of Silk Spectre. In the comics, it's framed at a distance, with the camera not lending any weight to the scene or forcing the audience into a certain perspective. You can say the framing is an objective view of what happened. In the movie, Snyder frames it like this. The simplest way to describe his style is that no matter what the camera is focusing on in a Snyder movie, the subject is being glorified, demonized, or fetishized. Part of the reason for all of this is that Snyder doesn't make movies about people who undergo much change. It's one of the reasons I find his movies so boring. Instead, he seems to pick a character he thinks is awesome and then just shows them being awesome in glorifying poses for 2 hours. Or 4 hours, which actually kind of makes him somewhat suited to a project like Justice League, at least in contrast to the rest of the industry at the moment, and specifically Joss Whedon's approach to the characters. Snyder's one of the only filmmakers making these kinds of movies that treats his characters with a super serious sense of gravitas, and a lot of that comes from the way that he just can't help lavishing his camera over these heroes, putting them in slow motion tableaus that smack you over the head with the idea that this person is amazing. He can't even help from doing it when the person is shaving. So while I am usually irritated by the excessive use of slow motion tableaus and by Snyder's visual framing choices in general, I find them appropriate in Justice League given the subject matter. But let's talk about what those images are saying too. A pervasive idea in Snyder's filmography is being terrified about a loss of identity and agency. It's fitting that his debut film is the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead, a zombie apocalypse movie that ditches the original film's critique of capitalism to instead promote a fundamentalist Christian worldview. Instead of zombies that retain some semblance of humanity, Snyder's zombies are just plain monsters. They represent the fear of losing one's agency, identity, and the American way of life as a result of acting outside of God's plans, specifically for allowing homosexuality, sex out of wedlock, and abortion. Yeah. Zombies just happen to be the enemies in this movie, but a faceless army of monsters pops up in almost all of Snyder's films. In 300, the Spartans are positioned in the film as these heroes defending freedom, even though the actual Spartans had a slave society, while Xerxes' endless hordes of soldiers threaten to enslave them. His most elite soldiers wear identical masks, signaling to us that the stakes of losing in battle against Xerxes is the loss of identity. In the Owls of Ga'Hoole, if an owl is forced to sleep under the full moon, they become moon-blinked, a catatonic state. The bad guys once again all wear identical masks, erasing their individual identities by joining the Horde. In Sucker Punch, Baby Doll fights against all sorts of enemies, including people wearing masks and zombies wearing masks. The entire film is also a fantastical vision experienced by the main character in the moments leading up to her own lobotomy, which also leaves her without agency. To summarize, it is a trope of Snyder's films that the villains are faceless monsters with no agency, and that the protagonists fear losing their individual identities and control over themselves. And he uses that as a way to condemn whatever ideology the particular film is against. So let's talk about Parademons. In the Whedon cut, we are told this about Parademons.
Millions fell before his blade, arose again as its parademons. Nightmare creatures who feed on fear.
The Whedon cut isn't about much, but there is the barest attempt to make it about overcoming fear. When the team is first fighting Steppenwolf, Barry has a moment where he's afraid to fight, and Batman has to help him overcome that.
Right, okay, yeah, here's the thing. See, I'm afraid of bugs.
Then at the end, when Superman arrives, Steppenwolf starts to feel fear, causing the parademons to turn on him and feed on him. It's a pretty hackneyed ending. All of that is removed in the Snyder Cut, and instead we have a completely different lore for the parademons.
The Unity cleanses a planet with fire, transforming it into a copy of the enemy's world. All who live become servants of Darkseid, alive but drained of life. Parademons.
Rather than this focus on fear, Snyder focuses on the loss of agency and identity. If the bad guy wins, he's going to make us all the same and make us his servants. The fear of becoming just one of the faceless horde is also directly tied into Snyder's anxieties about communism, more explicitly in the Snyder Cut than it is in the Whedon Cut. In the Snyder Cut, the villain makes his base in a town that was abandoned after a nuclear disaster, a direct parallel to Chernobyl. He does a similar thing in the Whedon Cut, but the fact that there are civilians living nearby doesn't trigger that connection to Chernobyl as much as the Snyder Cut does. The entire plot also revolves around stopping the three mother boxes from being united into one unless they form the dreaded Unity. Oh no, can't have Unity. This does create a bit of a problem for the story though, because this is a superhero team-up movie. It's a genre entirely based on a group of people coming together and learning the value of teamwork. But because Snyder also wants to have these anti-communist digs, the heroes have to come together in a very particular way so that it doesn't undermine the overarching message. So in the Lord of the Rings-esque flashback, Diana has to spend an inordinate amount of time informing us that all of these different factions all came together to fight Darkseid, but they don't have a formal alliance or anything. They all just individually decided to be there, and it just so happens that they're fighting together. They're not united, they're just all there. The same also has to be true in the present, where only a handful of super people are needed to do what once required entire armies. A scene where the heroes unite the world around a common threat just could never happen in a Snyder movie. And I mean, if you're going to make the Faceless Horde a critique of whatever ideology you don't like, then I guess I'm fine with him doing some Red Scare stuff rather than the raging Islamophobia of 300 or the homophobia of Dawn of the Dead. But why is this fear of losing agency and individuality such a common theme in Snyder's work? So again, Zack Snyder is an Ayn Randian libertarian. Ayn Rand is a terrible just terrible author of really bad books like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which express her no good, horrible, very bad ideology objectivism, which really just boils down to the idea that it's bad to care about other people, actually. Please feel free to not write a 10,000 word comment about how that's an oversimplification. If you want more on this subject, I recommend this video by Curio as well as Maggie Mayfish's series on Snyder. Links in the description. The Ayn Randian influence is the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 reasons why I don't like Snyder's version of Superman. Snyder's Superman gets stuck on this idea of not being responsible for other people. His father is always telling him that he maybe shouldn't help others. In Batman v Superman, his mom fills in that role too.
You don't know this world a thing.
And I just find that such an uninteresting internal conflict to have. It's not relatable, and it almost surgically removes everything that defines Superman as Superman. I'm fine with unfaithful adaptations, and if I just look at the Snyderverse as this weird Elseworlds where Pa Kent reads Atlas Shrugged, then I can sorta appreciate it as its own thing, but I just can't connect with this character who is such a grump all the time. In the case of the Snyder Cut specifically, though, all of these Ayn Randian elements are much less pronounced than they are in Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. Now, don't get me wrong, the Ayn Randian stuff still bleeds into different parts of the film. In the Whedon cut, the character of Cyborg is barely part of the movie and has no real story of his own. He's even biased against in the editing of the scenes. Like, this scene where the characters have to roll an acrobatics check to cross a bridge, we watch all of the other characters make the jump, but then the scene cuts before Cyborg crosses. And the audience is just supposed to assume that he got across, but it also subtly informs us that he is the least important member of the group in this story. The Snyder Cut gives Cyborg his full backstory, a real internal conflict and an emotional story to resolve that is tied directly into the main plot at the climax. It's some of the best stuff in the movie, but he also has to slip in some Ayn Randian stuff into the character's ideology. There's this scene where Cyborg is discovering his powers and his father is narrating all the different things he'll be able to do, as well as the ethical questions those powers will make him ask.
The world's monetary systems and its complex interactions will seem as easy to manipulate for you as a child's plaything. The question, no, the challenge, won't be doing it. It will be not doing, not seeing.
And surprise, surprise, Cyborg's dad happens to have the exact same ideology as Superman's dad. Cyborg has the power to literally eradicate poverty, but instead he picks and chooses those he thinks deserve to be helped. The movie doesn't spend a lot of time here, and it doesn't really interact with the rest of the story, but it is another example of how Snyder imposes his worldview onto almost all of his characters. It's the most pronounced in Batman v Superman, which is such a slog to get through because all of the characters are exactly the same. They're all Ayn Randian ideal manly men characters who believe the exact same things. At least all of the characters who are important to the plot. Bruce Wayne, Lex Luthor, and Superman. All of them believe that there are threats to world safety out there, that they are the only ones to have the authority to protect the world, and will use whatever means they deem proper at the time to deal with those threats. It means the movie has no thematic conversation, no battle of opposing ideas that would demonstrate a deeper truth. And it makes the movie just so boring. Again, though, in Justice League, his inclination to make every character John Galt is mitigated to a degree. It's still there, hemming and hawing over just how much they should help others as part of Cyborg, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, and Martian Manhunter's stories, but it doesn't dominate the movie. Actually, what's sort of surprising about the Snyder Cut is just how much it resembles the boilerplate DC universe. Like, the prologue of Darkseid trying to conquer Earth feels like something you'd see in any of the animated DC movies or the comics. Cyborg, apart from that one Ayn Randian moment, is given a pretty much comics-accurate origin story, and Wonder Woman seems exactly like Wonder Woman. Aquaman and the Flash are still recognizable even though he characterizes them in unique ways, with Aquaman being a rock star jock type and Barry coded as neurodivergent, but that's mostly just their affectation. Snyder doesn't have a wildly unique take on these characters in the way that he did with Superman. Their ideology is perfectly conventional. What I'm striking at, though, is that the characters that he seemed to have the most interest in, the ones that he had a real take on, were the ones that were either god figures or billionaires. Those are the characters that are useful to him in communicating his ideology. So when they are not at the forefront, his themes take a back seat. The result is a movie that is still recognizably a Zack Snyder film, with his usual visual style, common themes, and ideology, but one where all of the Zack Snydery stuff is less pervasive than usual. So, you know, it was fine. On this channel, I've talked about a lot of science fiction and fantasy stories, and one of the most important qualities of any good sci-fi or fantasy is unique and interesting world building. If you want to pick up some tangible techniques that can make your world building better, then check out Link and Michelle's course on the subject on Skillshare, the sponsor of this video. Skillshare is an excellent online learning community with thousands of classes on topics like freelancing, video production, and writing. So check out the course, Science Fiction and Fantasy, Creating Unique and Powerful Worlds, if you want to give it a go. And if you do, then click on the link in the description of this video. The first 1,000 people to do so will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. So give it a look and let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, everyone, and a big thank you to my patrons for supporting me on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, you can head over to patreon.com/justright and pitch in as little as $1 per video. Keep writing, everyone.